Renan's a pro, I don't even worry about it anymore. I
She's
used
good,
to
isn't
get
he?
all anxious about like this kind of thing, and now I know Renan's just going to take care of it. So it makes it easy.
I used to get real nervous on the radio doing that kind of stuff, but I've done it for about 15 years. I don't, but
Yeah, I really enjoy your show
we
with
have
Sally
fun.
Mock.
We
It's
have-
so fun.
we had a little bit of a bump last week, but Sally's up in Iceland with a friend.
Oh.
So another reporter, Nikki Olette, handled it, and she was very nervous, but she handled it great. She did a nice job. But it's kind of fun, you know.
Yeah. But no, Renan's got it all. Renan's amazing. He's just the best.
Where did he come from before he?
He was working at ITSD,
Ah,
the state computer,
boy, he
main
knows his
computer
stuff,
thing. He
doesn't he?
really knows his stuff. And it's just so personable and easygoing
great.
and willing to help out. And
Can I leave and go just say hi to someone?
you sure can.
Okay.
You can do anything you want.
Yeah. Hey there, Jim. How are you? Nice to see you. There you go. Looking good. How about those deals he did? Huh? Kind of nice.
Yeah, they're nice. He's a smart guy. You know?
Is he just here part time? Is that?
Yeah, he's an intern.
Yeah, that's great. Is he designer basically? Or?
I think he's a teacher.
Hmm.
Like a grade school or high school. Very good work.
Yeah.
Funny there, you know, you learn the people that you like to work with. And they're every time you go to people.
And the ones you don't. Huh?
Right.
So I hear.
It's not officially been announced yet that she's taking the job. So I'm like really
I'll be quiet.
eager to have that announcement made. Because I think she'll be a great addition. I really do.
I think so. I don't know if I have to clear the video.
Well, I was that Bruce was going to announce today that she'd asked if he would wait until she talked to her. Kind of wait, sure, department of her, I don't know,
Department chair or
or
something.
something like that. He did. So, but he told me yesterday on the QT, on the down low, that she had.
Yeah, I got a note from them this morning. So.
Oh, so maybe it isn't.
Well, it was just to Chuck Rankin today. So.
Oh, okay. So I think
And then he said he wanted to get the selection committee together.
why?
Hi, Diana. How are you?
scratch or something on the block.
Sounds like something I do around the house. You got a brown Sharpie for tables and a black one for windows.
Our dog, when he was a puppy, like ate our windowsills, and my husband just repaired them with Bondo, which is something you use in an auto body shop. So we have these wooden windowsills, and then we have this like.
I don't know Bondo.
My husband used to work in an auto body shop, and it's something that you use to fill in like dents. And
Oh,
scrapes.
really?
Yeah.
That sounds fancy.
Putty-based epoxy. It's awesome stuff.
It works for most anything, huh?
All right, let's start it. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Martha Kohl, and I'm a historical specialist here at the Montana Historical Society, and I am delighted to welcome everyone to the 8th installment of Montana History in 9 Easy Lessons. If you missed the first 7 installments, they are available for your viewing pleasure on YouTube. And you can just go to the Montana Historical Society's homepage, and there's a link from there to find those recordings. If you're a teacher, see me afterwards, and I can sign an OPI renewal unit. I would like to welcome you, invite you to come back next week when Steve Lozar will be talking about tribal sovereignty in the self-determination period. And now it is my great pleasure. One of the things that I really wanted when I conceptualized this series was to help us think about Montana history after, 1920. Seems like we really do well in that 1862 to 1920 period. And so I'm particularly delighted to introduce our speaker today, who's going to talk about the 1960s through the 1990s. Chuck Johnson is a Great Fall native who covered most of this era as a journalist. He worked for 44 years as a state political and government reporter for the Associated Press, Great Falls Tribune, Lee Newspapers, and the Bozeman Daily Chronicle. He has a bachelor's degree in journalism and a master's degree in history from the University of Montana, and currently he serves on the Montana Historical Society's Board of Trustees. So, with no further ado, please help me welcome Chuck Johnson.
Well, good afternoon. Is this working? Let me get it up a little. I'd like to thank Martha and Kirby Lambert for inviting me to participate in this, and thank you all for attending. I see a fair number of people who are participating in these activities I'm going to be talking about in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. A couple of caveats. I'm just going to be focusing on basically state government things. Doing Congress and presidential topics would make this about a 4-hour presentation. I consider this one of the most important eras in Montana history, one that led to revolutionary changes in our state government and laws along the way. It was an unusual period, and then as time went on in the 80s and 90s, we sort of saw a counter-revolution coming up with attempts to lower or reduce taxes or vote on taxes, weaken environmental laws, cut red tape, and in efforts to spur economic development. But from the key period to me is the 60s and the 70s, because in that period, Montanans seemed to seize control of their state government, perhaps for the first time in history. For decades, as you know, the Anaconda Company, Montana Power Company, and their allies in banking, timber, and railroads exerted what I think was an inordinate influence over the Montana state government activities and the 3 branches of government, the executive, judicial, and legislative. This period of change was unique in state government history, and a number of factors contributed to it, in my opinion. I was fortunate to cover it as a State House reporter. The governor in the 1960s for much of the era was Tim Babcock. He was the lieutenant governor and moved up to governor when Don Nutter died in a tragic plane crash in January of 1962. Babcock was in the oil field trucking business and was a personable, probably more personable than Nutter, but continued Nutter's generally conservative policies. A key decision happened in 1964 when the U.S. Supreme Court issued its Reynolds versus Sims decision, and it changed the makeup of state legislatures throughout the country. The court held that all state legislative chambers were subject to the one-person, one-vote principle, that state legislative chambers must represent, quote, people, not trees or acres, in districts, quote, of nearly equal population or as practicable. In most states, the upper house, the Senate, was set up like the U.S. Senate. It was a set number of senators, not based on population. In Montana, for instance, the Senate had 56 members, one for each county. So Yellowstone County, which had a population then of 79,000 people, had the same number of senators, one, as Petroleum County, which had 894 people. As a result, conservative rural interests were grossly overrepresented, and more progressive liberal interests in the urban areas were underrepresented. Babcock told the legislature in 1965 that, quote, the theory of one person, one vote simply does not fit in Montana, unquote. A few days later, a woman from Butte, Phoebe Herwig, sued in federal court, and the court gave the legislature a chance to reapportion, but they failed to do so. Finally, a federal panel came up with new legislative districts, which the legislature accepted 2 years later. So suddenly, urban areas gained an influence in the legislature. Babcock sought re-election in 1968. He'd been a popular governor, but his popularity had waned when he'd lost to Lee Metcalf for the U.S. Senate in 1966. Babcock had said he would never run for a U.S. Senate seat or another office while holding another, but he did just that, and it hurt him. It was also a time when Montana experienced one of its periodic shortfalls of revenues. It happens every 8 or 10 or 12 years. We're in one right now as we talk. He said the state needed to enact a 3% state sales tax to raise about $60 million over the next 2 years. His opponent was, let's see if I can work this thing, Forrest Anderson, the longtime attorney general, who ran a campaign under the slogan, pay more, what for? Probably the best four-letter slogan in Montana politics. It worked. Anderson argued a sales tax wasn't needed. He could find ways to save money through executive reorganization, cutting costs, and increasing some existing taxes. He ended up unseating Babcock 54% to 42%. Anderson took office in January 1969. He served only 1 year, one 4-year term, and didn't seek re-election because he had major health problems. In that one term, Anderson oversaw unprecedented and dramatic changes in Montana state government. He stood about 5'4" tall. He was a shrewd, experienced politician whose supporters called him the Silver Fox or simply the Fox. He said once, the fox isn't going to get trapped in any box. He was an unlikely reformer. Anderson was a conservative Democrat who liked the smoke-filled rooms. Liberal groups had supported someone else in the Democratic primary in 1968, but Anderson won. He was without question the best qualified person to ever serve as governor of Montana. He had had experiences in all three branches. He'd been elected to the legislature from Helena as county attorney. He'd been a Supreme Court justice and served as Attorney General for 12 years. He knew there were where the changes were needed. He knew how to get things done, and he knew where the bodies were buried. Anderson's style was unique. He was a strong leader, but no micromanager. He would eat breakfast at home with his family, read a couple of newspapers, and then spend an hour and a half on the phone with his top assistants and directors. According to his son Newell in an interview with Evan Barrett, oftentimes then Anderson would have a friend drive him out to his cabin in Craig, and they'd fish for the day. Alec Hansen, who worked for Anderson, said the thing about it, he was a hardworking guy. The thing about it, a dumb guy could work all day and get nothing done. This is Alec talking. A smart guy could work for 15 minutes and change the world. That's more the way he was. He kept signed, undated letters of resignation in his top desk drawer from each of his directors and cabinet members, if he needed them. I don't believe he did. His top priority was to reorganize state government, which had been set up in the late 1880s when Montana became a state. Montana had what was called the weak governor system, common in the West. There was little accountability and responsibility. It was designed to disperse power throughout state government and not concentrate much in the governor's office. It might have worked then, but it clearly wasn't working by the late 60s. This was the government structure. All these little boxes were different agencies. 161 of them. There were departments, commissions, agencies, most headed by boards, sometimes advisory, sometimes with power, appointed by the governor, but he didn't get control of the boards till his fourth year. So they ran more or less independently, ignoring the governor when they thought it was in their best interest. So when something went wrong, there was finger pointing. Well, it was their fault, it was my fault. As Anderson put it in his pithy way, the public says, "What are those nuts doing? We want to get all those nuts in one cage." He was a colorful guy, swore like a trooper. I think newspaper reporters had to agree not to use the curse words. He asked the 1969 legislature to put a constitutional referendum on the 1970 ballot that would call for no more than 20 state government agencies, except for constitutionally mandated offices, the other elected offices. The nifty advertising slogan used to promote the idea was 20's plenty. Montanans agreed. They voted for it 70% to 30%. A research effort that was overseen by a commission of 4 Democratic legislators and 4 Republican ones, with Anderson chairing the committee. There was a research commission that was overseen by this committee. They hired William Duke Crowley, an old colleague of Anderson's, who was a law professor in Missoula, and then George Bozeman was the deputy director. They had some excellent researchers who spent the next year or so evaluating how state government was working, how other states did it, and came up with some ideas. It came to the legislature in 1971. They passed the plan mostly intact, the legislature did, with one exception. Because of the political muscle of the Montana Stock Growers Association, the legislature kept the Livestock Commission under a part-time board that hired its own executive secretary, instead of allowing the governor to appoint a director. Throughout the period since then, I'd say the livestock department has been one of the worst run departments, if not the worst, because of this. There are always budget problems and always issues over there that you don't see in other departments. Montana conservationists tried to do the same with the Montana Fish and Game Commission, but that failed. Anderson got appointment of the director there. And he was feuding with the director, Frank Dunkel, who was revered by conservationists at the time, and Dunkel later resigned and ran for governor as a Republican. One thing Anderson was able to do was sneak through a very important provision in this massive bill. It called for the unified investment of state funds under a state board of investments. Previously, all these little agencies, the 161, had their own bank accounts. They invested this money, they deposited the money in banks, often in no interest or low interest accounts. The legislative audit had done an audit a few years earlier that found that the state was passing up millions of dollars in foregone interest by not having a common investment. So he sneaked that through, and the bankers didn't find out until the bill became law. So today, the Montana Board of Investments manages a portfolio of $18 billion, including state and teachers' pensions funds. So now under this reorganization, governors appoint most of the directors, save for the livestock department. And responsibility is pinpointed with the governor, and so is accountability. Here's the structure as of 2009. You can see straight lines of authority. This is how it works in most businesses, and this is how it works for the state now, and I think more or less successfully under most administrations. The second major government change that occurred in the Anderson administration was the ratification, the calling of a constitutional convention and its ratification. Again, this was put to the voters in 1970. They agreed 65% to 35% to call a convention to either revise, alter, or amend the old Constitution, which was adopted in 1889, with William Clark, the Copper King, as the presiding officer. A key group in getting this referendum passed was the Montana League of Women Voters. They worked tirelessly at the legislature and tirelessly at the polling place to try to get this through. The league leaders at that time that lobbied the legislature were Dorothy Eck, Daphne Bugbee, later Daphne Bugbee Jones, and Jean Anderson. Bugbee and Eck were both elected to the convention. A study by the Legislative Council concluded there was a substantial need to revise the convention. The Constitutional Revision Commission unanimously supported calling a constitutional convention as the best way to do it. The election of 100 delegates to the convention proved to be a once-in-a-lifetime event for many people. It drew great interest around the state. 247 Democrats ran for the convention, 232 Republicans, and 32 independents, and 4 new reform candidates. One reason it was so attractive is the Montana Supreme Court in 1971 had decided in a case that people holding existing offices like legislators, mayors, county commissioners were ineligible to run because they would be holding 2 elective offices at the same time. And by law, they could hold only 1. Well, this opened the door. Everyone thought they could run and have a shot to win, and many of them did. 100 were elected in November of 1971. Democrats won a huge majority over Republicans, 58 to 36, while 6 independents were elected. This was in sharp contrast to the election for the Montana House a year earlier, when Republicans had a 55 to 49 advantage. So how did Democrats win this big majority? Well, times were changing. There were big reforms going on nationally, peace movements, civil rights movements, efforts to get the vote for young people, women's movement, a whole series of things were going on nationally and also in Montana. The Montana AFL-CIO played an important role in this under Jim Murray, who's here. They organized a lot of groups to fight together on their causes. The League of Women Voters was involved. And, of course, there was Indian sovereignty, and Steve Lozer will talk about that next week. Another factor was at play. The 1971 legislature and Governor Anderson deadlocked over a needed revenue solution. And they met in 2 separate long special sessions before the Republican legislative leaders and Anderson decided to let voters decide this issue at the same election that the constitutional delegates were involved. So voters were given a choice for reducing the 40% income tax surcharge that was in place to 10% and enacting a 2% sales tax, or against reducing the income tax surcharge and against enacting a sales tax. The group against the sales tax, Citizens Opposed to Sales Tax, or COST, backed by the AFL-CIO, had sued to find out who was funding the pro-sales tax group, Save Our State. The day before the election, a district judge in Helena ordered the pro-sales tax group to open its books and show who was funding it. Records showed what people suspected. The group had raised about $48,000 in donations, or twice what the opponents had raised. The money had come from some of the state's largest corporations or their subsidiaries, the Anaconda Company, Burlington Northern, the Montana Power Company, and Glacier Park Company. By a 70 to 30% margin, voters rejected the sales tax and kept the 40% surcharge in. And I think that had a big factor in helping Democrats win the big majority in the Constitutional Convention. The Constitutional Convention had had a staff working for a year or so as well, like executive reorganization, which looked at the, what other states did, what the strengths and weaknesses of Montana's Constitution were, and came up with a lot of, they put out about 10 or 15 of these books like this with their research reports. The leader of this research effort was Dale Harris, who was a brilliant man who'd been working to get a constitutional convention called for about 4 or 5 years. The election results showed that 19 women were elected among the 100 delegates, many of them League of Women Voters members. This was unprecedented. The 1971 legislature had 2 women, Toni Roselle in the Senate and a freshman named Dorothy Bradley in the House. So this was a huge, huge gain, and I think the League of Women Voters got a lot of members to join when they filed. The youngest delegate was 24-year-old Maynann Robinson, now Ellingson, then a graduate student in Missoula, and the oldest was 73-year-old Lucille Spear, a retired librarian. By occupation, the Constitutional Convention comprised 24 lawyers, 20 farmers and ranchers, 17 business owners, 13 educators, 11 who call themselves housewives, 5 ministers or priests, 4 who work for the media, 2 bankers, a beekeeper, and a retired FBI agent. It was a pretty good mix of Montanans. 18 delegates had served in the legislature before. 4 had been mayors and 4 had been city council members, while 8 had been elected to county office. They had run on labels of political party, Republicans or Democrats or independent, but they wanted to downplay politics at the convention. They took a bold move and they decided to sit alphabetically at their desks, A to Z, rather than having one party on one side and one on the other like the legislature does. It worked pretty well. I wrote some newspaper columns later advocating that for the legislature, but they fell on deaf ears. Delegates elected Leo Graybill, an attorney from Great Falls and a Democrat, as their president, and divided the other offices amid both parties. Graybill was a successful trial lawyer with a reputation for being headstrong and a little prickly to get along with, but he generally did a great job overseeing the convention. He kept them working on a tight schedule. They finished in less time than anticipated and completed under budget. The delegates decided they were not going to be another legislature. They renamed the House chambers as Assembly Hall. They banned lobbyists from the floor at all times. They required lobbyists to file detailed reports showing how much they'd spent lobbying, which didn't happen in the legislature till 1980 after Citizens Initiative. What's more, they solicited proposals from citizens around the state and received hundreds of them. Time magazine sent a reporter to watch the convention. He called it a people's crusade that produced a model document. So what were some of the major changes? The preamble was is often highlighted as there they are sitting in alphabetical order. Here's the preamble, which often gets national acclaim. We, the people of Montana, grateful to God for the quiet beauty of our state and the grandeur of our mountains, the vastness of our rolling plains, and desiring to improve the equality of life, equality of opportunity, and to secure the blessings of liberty for this and future generations, do ordain and establish this Constitution. The Constitution contains an explicit right to privacy, a right to clean and healthful environment, a right to the public right to know, with a right to attend government meeting and examine documents, a right for the people to participate in their government, a right to equality regardless of age, race, or sex, lowered the age of adulthood to 18, although that got moved around when the Federal Transportation Department threatened to withhold highway money, so that was lowered for purposes of drinking, or raised to 21. Candidates for governor and lieutenant governor would run as a team together instead of separately. Created the Office of Consumer Counsel to represent consumers in utility rate cases. Provided for a judicial nomination commission to screen applicants for the Supreme Court and district judges. It gave the Board of Regents full governance authority over the university system. It allowed constitutional amendments to be used to amend the Constitution for the first time. And it provided an automatic vote on whether to call another constitutional convention every 20 years. It set up single-member districts for legislators instead of having them run multi-member in their districts. It set up a reapportionment commission to redistrict after every federal census. And it originally set up annual sessions, which were undone by the first constitutional initiative that passed in '74. It also set up, it declared that the state recognizes the distinct and unique cultural heritage of American Indians and is committed to its educational goals of preservation of their cultural integrity. This so-called Indian Education for All sat in the Constitution for more than 30 years before Governor Brian Schweitzer sought funding for it. Now, schools across Montana have Indian Education for All from K through 12. The most controversial sections were two. One gave the state authority to appraise, assess, and equalize the valuation of all property. Previously, county assessors had done this job. However, there were allegations that some local assessors showed favoritism toward friends and family, and low assessments often resulted in getting more schools foundation money, so there was an incentive to do this. The other controversial section was a provision for the equality of educational opportunity to each person in the state. This has led to two big lawsuits that the state lost over school funding, and the rumor is that another one's pending. The Constitutional Convention adjourned early and prepared to spend the $45,000 that delegates had saved from the appropriation to spend on, quote, voter education, unquote. The Montana Taxpayers Association successfully sued to stop that, and the Montana Supreme Court halted the spending. Unable to spend the money, delegates formed a ragtag group of advocates for the ratification election. They distributed bumper stickers that used a comment that Reverend George Harper, a delegate, made on the floor. And these were circulated around the state. Another delegate, former First Lady Betty Babcock, Tim's wife, donated office space, phones, and a copier and typewriters at the Colonial Inn, which they owned, and that became the hub of the ratification effort. The election results from the '72 election showed it passed by the narrowest of margins, 2,500 votes out of some 230,000 votes. 12 counties, mostly urban, supported ratification, while 44 more rural counties, plus Silver Bow County, opposed it. Silver Bow, though, voted for the gambling alternative. which didn't count since they didn't vote for the ratification. They had 3 side issues on the ballot: switch to a one-house legislature, legalize gambling, allow the legislature to pass laws supporting gambling, and whether to retain or do away with the death penalty. Voters rejected they rejected the first one and accepted the last 2. But as the results were coming in, some of us noticed that more people voted on the side issues than some of the other provisions. So questions arose whether the document had actually been approved by a majority of the people who'd taken ballots. And as this was going on, the secretaries of the Board of Examiners had to certify the election. After discussion, Governor Anderson quickly grabbed the certification form and signed it in what proved to be a quick and key move. Frank Murray, the crotchety Secretary of State, said, "I don't see you sign it." Anderson replied, "Well, I'll sign it for you again, you son of a bitch." Almost immediately, the Montana Farm Bureau sued over the validity of the election. The Montana Supreme Court okayed the election 3-2, and then the Farm Bureau went to the federal courts, which upheld the election. Timing is everything in politics. Had this constitutional convention been held 8 years or 10 years earlier or 10 years later, the document would have been an entirely different one, probably far more conservative. In the late 1960s and early 70s, a widespread environmental movement took hold in Montana and nationally. People were looking at the consequences of mining and pollution and demanding change. In Missoula, a group called GASP, Gals Against Smog and Pollution, formed, and this is a protest at what was then Horner Waldorf, later Smurfit Stone, which spewed out a lot of pollution there. This is Nancy Rice Fritz, later a legislature, and this was a powerful group that regularly held protests out there. The state's two premier environmental groups formed during the early 70s. Phil and Robin Tawney formed the Montana Environmental Information Center to lobby the legislature and work on environmental matters full-time. In the past, Don Aldrich, a retired Forest Service official, had done the lobbying in his spare time for the Montana Wildlife Association, but needed year-round help. Out in eastern Montana, farmers and ranchers formed a group called Northern Plains Resource Council out of concern over the North Central Power Study, which was released in 1971. The Bureau of Reclamation study, written in response to an anticipated energy crisis, called for the construction of 42 coal-fired power plants in eastern Montana, Wyoming, and the Dakotas. Each plant was to generate 10,000 megawatts annually. With Anderson unable to run again, the Democratic Lieutenant Governor Thom Judge won the governorship over Big Ed Smith, a Republican legislator. At 38, Judge was the youngest governor in Montana history. He ran on the slogan, "Ability you can trust." He'd been a state legislator for three or four terms and then lieutenant governor. In those days, the lieutenant governor's job was a part-time job. The lieutenant governor ran separately with the governor. The lieutenant governor presided over the Montana Senate during legislative sessions every other year and presided as governor when Governor Anderson left the state. Anderson and Judge were never particularly close. There's a 21-year age gap between them. When they were sworn in, Anderson supposedly said something like this to Judge: "Great, we'll see you again in 4 years." Thom Judge was a natural promoter. He owned an advertising agency that did public relations statewide. With Anderson unable to travel much, Judge accepted many of the speaking engagements and started getting many of his own. His former secretary told me that Judge had bought one of these early tape recorders that you could plug into the lighter of a car. So he'd go to have her to speak, and on the way back would dictate letters to everyone he met. He'd hand the tape over to his secretary, and letters would go out that day to everyone he met, and that was the beginning of the Thom Judge machine. And it was a formidable one at the time. He was inexhaustible, traveled far and wide as lieutenant governor to promote Montana, and of course himself. Judge faced a legislature that had big Democratic majorities in 1973. He signed some of Montana's cornerstone environmental protection laws. These included the Montana Strip Mining and Reclamation Act, the Montana Water Use Act, the Montana Utility Siting Act, the Strip Mine Coal Conservation Act. 2 years later, the Montana Facility Siting Act, or the Major Facility Act, and the Coal Severance Tax Act, which set the tax at 30% or nearly twice as high as Wyoming's. Voters passed a constitutional amendment to set aside 30% of the coal severance tax into 50% of the severance tax into a permanent trust fund. It couldn't be broken into by the legislature unless 3/4 of each house agreed, which it didn't. It was an unprecedented string of environmental wins for Judge. The state's economy was booming in part because of natural resource development. The governor's wife, Carol, had worked at a state mental institution in Warm Springs as a student as part of her registered nurse training program. She'd sneaked Thom Judge in there to see how sordid the conditions were there. As a result, Judge proposed, and the legislature spent a lot of money to fix up these institutions, hire more staff in these places which were really just warehouses. This included deinstitutionalization of some of the institutions to move the patients back to their hometowns into group homes. He also proposed and succeeded in using federal revenue share funds to build the new state men's prison in the 1970s and outside of Deer Lodge to replace the dungeon-like fortress that had been the prison there for many years. Judge also signed bills into law that allowed state government and local government workers and teachers to form unions and negotiate for their wages, and to create the Montana Human Rights Commission to investigate discrimination complaints. For all these successes, Judge was dogged by an issue that arose in the 1972 campaign and really stayed with him through his career. He'd failed to account for $94,000 in campaign donations tagged as anonymous and $81,000 in campaign spending. He refused to account for the money except to say he'd done nothing wrong. Here's a cartoon from Paul Driscoll, who was a student at the University of Montana at the time. In 1972, the Republican Attorney General, Bob Woodall, had launched an investigation into alleged corruption in the state workers' comp fund, alleging that lawyers, doctors, state officials, and politicians were all making money off of a corrupt system. He later initiated a grand jury investigation. Woodall had cracked down on gambling in Montana earlier, earning the nickname Bingo Bob. According to Larry Pettit's 2010 book, If You Live by the Sword, he was Judge's campaign manager in 1972, and then his brother-in-law. Judge had received a significant amount of major donations from personal injury lawyers. Judge didn't want to reveal them because he feared political consequences for them. So Woodall's investigation focused on this sort of thing, but really never came to much. Judge crossed out the names so they were never reported publicly. Pettit said this was not illegal at the time, but did raise suspicions. Judge and Woodall faced off for governor in 1976. It was a nasty, nasty campaign, and Judge ended up winning 62% to 37%. As the second term began, Judge saw his Democratic majorities in the legislature start to decline. The progressive era was ending. His marriage broke up. He passed by 2 chances to run for his dream job as a U.S. Senator and had hoped to serve in Jimmy Carter's cabinet, but wasn't chosen. He began traveling the world ostensibly to promote Montana's products. He seemed to lose interest in being governor. While he traveled, his lieutenant governor, Ted Schwinn, was meeting with farmers, ranchers, truckers, energy company officials during ag and energy crises. Judge had assigned him those topics, and I might add it's probably the last time a governor assigned major issues to the lieutenant governor. Schwinn was a former legislator who'd been a farmer from Wolf Point, served as state lands commissioner under Governors Anderson and Judge. And during the 1979 legislature, there was a draft movement to draft Schwinn to be governor. Judge had not committed yet to run, but eventually did. It was a difficult race between the sitting governor and the lieutenant governor. Schwinn won the primary about 11,000 votes by relying on grassroots volunteers, despite being outspent by Judge. Judge got in the race late and didn't run a very good campaign. He later said it was a mistake to run for a third term. The race left hard feelings. To this day, Democrats in Helena that still remember, some are bitter about who lined up with whom. Schwinn went on to defeat Jack Ramirez, a Billings lawyer and legislative leader, 55 to 45, to win the governor's race in 1980. About a month before the election, ARCO announced it was going to close its smelter in Anaconda and its refinery in Great Falls, resulting in several thousand layoffs. Shortly thereafter, it closed its mine in Butte. At one point, ARCO's predecessor, the Anaconda Company, and its subsidiaries had issued paychecks to 3 out of every 4 Montana private sector workers. Now ARCO had less than 20 Montanans on its payroll. In contrast to Judge, Schwinn opened up state government, giving his daily schedule to reporters. All meetings were open to cover unless the people he was meeting with didn't want that. He even listed his phone number in the Helena phone directory, and people could and did call the governor's mansion to visit with him. He was probably the right governor for the right time in Montana. The state experienced several severe revenue crises in the 1980s, from a recession and a farm crisis. Raised on the farm in the Great Depression, Schwinn knew how to pinch pennies. He knew he had to tighten state spending while promoting development. He led the ballot effort to pass his Build Montana program in 1982, and this provided grants and loans to businesses. Republicans couldn't find anyone to run against the popular Schwinn in 1984, so State Senator Pat Goodover stepped up to be the sacrificial lamb. He campaigned on the need to lower the state coal severance tax, which had made Montana coal uncompetitive with Wyoming's. Schwinn disagreed in the campaign, but then after he beat Goodover 70-30, Schwinn shocked Democrats by proposing in his State of the State address to cut the coal severance tax in half on new production. He called it the window of opportunity. It passed with the support of Republican and conservative Democrats. Production increased slightly, but future legislators lowered the tax permanently. Schwinn considered a third term, but decided to retire. 3 prominent Republicans were in the race: former Senator Stan Stevens of Havre, Secretary Jim Waltemeyer of Missoula, and Representative Cal Winslow of Billings. Waltemeyer was killed in a tragic plane crash during the campaign. Stevens won the primary, and in the Democratic primary, the party nominated none other than Thom Judge over 2 other men. It was a decision that Thom later said was a poor decision to run. Stevens won the GOP primary and went on to be the governor. Stevens had been a very successful businessman who co-owned a radio station in Havre and cable television companies throughout the High Line. He'd been a Republican Senate leader. Yet he struggled in the governor's chair and got no help from Democrats, who were furious about losing both the governorship and a U.S. Senate seat in 1988. He campaigned for 2 full years, traveling 150,000 miles. After he won, he took off for a 3-week trip to Barbados, where his brother lived. He wasn't around to make a lot of the key decisions in hiring staff and paid the consequences for it. 2 of his cabinet members withdrew after they were going to be probably not confirmed, and others had problems too. A lot of negative information came out about them. Stevens said it was difficult to attract Republican business people to come to Helena for jobs that paid far less than what they were making now, and no guarantee they would stay more than 4 years. He also tried to relax some environmental laws and cut red tape, but these efforts weren't successful. He appointed the first woman to the Montana Supreme Court, Diane Bars, and after she resigned, he appointed the next woman to the Montana Supreme Court, Carla Gray. Another revenue shortfall came. There's a pattern here you can see. And Stevens had to call a special session in 1992 to find a solution. Nothing happened in the January session after Democratic leaders verbally attacked him for the failure of the special session. Stevens responded in kind. The next day, he went to the hospital with stroke-like conditions. After seeing a specialist in Seattle, he decided not to run again. He later gave Republicans a gift in the summer. After Stevens' revenue plans were blocked again, Democrats came up with an idea called that was called the 7% solution. Slap a temporary 7% tax on every existing tax. Taxes on income, property, gasoline, beer, cigarettes, liquor, and everything else. It was an idea that Republicans were delighted to see. Every one of the lawmakers voted against it on the Republican side, but Democrats passed it. Stevens spoke out against it and let it take law without his signatures. Republicans gained control of both houses of the legislature, one house of the legislature in 92 and both houses in 94. Democrats haven't again controlled both houses since then. They also retained the governorship when Mark Roscoe replaced Stevens on the Republican ticket for governor. Roscoe had been Attorney General. He narrowly defeated Dorothy Bradley 51-48 in the 1992 election. It was the first election that featured 2 baby boomers, both well-spoken. They had more than 30 debates, forums, and joint appearances around the country. Both were running on offering a sales tax to be considered to Montana voters as a referendum. Bradley put out hers first, and there were a lot of money that she had would have gone to education, higher education, and social services. Roscoe put out his later, and it would have given a lot of the money back in taxpayer relief. His was the more popular plan. He won the election narrowly. But when Roscoe's plan got on the ballot, it went down 75-25. Meanwhile, a backup income tax plan was to take effect to make up the lost revenue. Enter Rob Nadelson. The University of Montana law professor launched a referendum on the backup plan that gathered enough signatures over time to stop the tax hike in its tracks. And voters rejected the income tax hike the next year. This was one of the first anti-tax measures that succeeded, but others were coming. In 1986, 3 sisters from the Bitterroot placed Constitutional Initiative 127 on the ballot. It would have abolished property taxes altogether and required voter approval before imposing a sales tax or increasing sales taxes or income taxes. It failed by only 37,000 votes. A number of other successful proposals like this were offered and didn't make it through the legislature or didn't make the ballot. In 1998, voters narrowly approved Rob Nadelson's proposal, which was called Have a Say in What You Pay, to have public votes on every tax and fee increase. The Montana Supreme Court later struck it down. Roscoe was an extremely popular governor who made few mistakes his first term. He defeated Nadelson in the 1996 primary, and he was running against former state senator Chet Blaylock in the general election. But a few weeks before the election, Blaylock died of a heart attack while driving to Missoula for a debate. His running mate, Senator Judy Jacobson, took Blaylock's place, but had little time to mount a campaign. Roscoe won with 81% of the vote. In Roscoe's second term, he agreed to support a major bill offered by the Montana Power Company to deregulate electric utilities. As the bill was drafted, it also included MDU and the rural electric co-ops, but they said, we don't want any part of this. In the end, only Montana Power and the Flathead Electric Co-op were included, and the Flathead Electric Co-op had financial problems, and Brian Schweitzer got his political start getting on the board of Flathead Electric Co-op and firing the manager. The bill was introduced after the halfway point in the 97 session and rushed through. The skids were greased by expert lobbying by the Montana Power Company and the big power users, the cement plants, oil refineries that all wanted it. Republican legislators naturally favored deregulation, and some Democrats voted for it. Sometime later, Montana Power made a decision that it was going to sell its power plants, and it sold them to Pennsylvania Power and Light for $900 million. It sold its distribution system to Northwestern Energy. The former Montana Power changed its name to Touch America to focus on unregulated fiber optic telecommunications. Touch America later filed for bankruptcy. Northwestern filed for bankruptcy, and Montana Power Company workers who had Montana Power stock that was now Touch America's stock ended up losing most of their 401k matches and were left with little money for retirement. The 1990s also featured a lot of activity in Montana that wasn't to our best interests. The Freemen had an armed compound in Jordan, and were in a standpoint with the FBI. They were taking out liens against local and state elected officials for multi-million dollars. They had amassed an armed compound out near Jordan. Future Lieutenant Governor and State Rep Carl O's had a person that worked on their family ranch that had ties to the Freemen. So he rode into the compound unarmed 19 times and helped negotiate a peaceful end to the standoff. This prevented another Waco or Ruby Ridge type situation in Montana. Up in northwestern Montana, John Trockman and the militia of Montana were active trying to do their thing near the Idaho border. Tax protester Red Beckman was organizing around Montana. In some counties, sheriffs proclaimed themselves having all authority over everyone in the county. And around this time, in April of '96, Unabomber Ted Kaczynski was arrested in his small cabin near Lincoln. Clearly, Montanans in this era were taking a different route to change their government than the folks had in the 1960s and 70s, and really not as successfully. Thank you very much.
So we have just a few minutes for a few questions. I'm sure a lot of you remember a lot of what Chuck talked about and have comments. Because this is being broadcast, no one can hear your comments who aren't in this room. So I'm going to ask you to save your comments. Chuck will be happy to talk to you afterwards, right?
Yep.
And answer more questions. But if there are specific short questions that you have that Chuck can answer, he'd be happy to take them now. Any questions? Yeah. Where did you get that? And I'm going to repeat the question again for the people out in our TV audience, I guess.
That was a New Yorker cartoon that hung on my bulletin board at work for many, many years, and you can see it ripped, and I put Scotch tape on it. You can see the thumbtack holes, but I thought it was a pretty good description of what was going on in Montana at the time. And it also has obsessed environmentalists, obsessed anti-environmentalists, macho writers and their hippie wives and their hippie children, Hollywood producers, cowboys in need of privacy, open air, and a full-time personal staff of 40. So it kind of captured the era better than about anything else I saw. Gene?
Out of all the reporting and things you did over the years, which issue would you point that you enjoyed and worked hardest on?
Okay, and the question was, in your years of reporting, which issue did you enjoy reporting on the most?
Probably the Constitutional Convention, because we were reworking government in Montana, and it was fun to see what were admittedly amateurs trying to come up with a new version of state government, and they did. Deregulation was a really interesting issue too, because we were tearing apart the system that had served Montana well. I think Montana Power formed 12-12-12, I believe, and had been going since and had been a very successful utility. So to watch it be torn apart and what happened to the people that worked there was pretty sad. And of course, we paid for all that. We paid for the dams twice now. We paid for them when Montana Power first got them, and then they sold them, and now Northwestern bought the dams again, which was probably a good decision, but we paid one more time for them. So I think that was an interesting era to cover too.
Question?
I was just saying what you're talking about is the period covered my whole working career, and it went through a lot of what you were discussing.
Yeah.
Nothing particular.
So did you have a question though?
So I don't
Oh,
have
okay.
any particular
All right, then I'm going to ask you to save that until after we're off mic. So, is there any other questions before we? Yeah. What happened to ARCO, and was it related to what happened to Montana Power?
Not really, although the Anaconda Company and Montana Power had been really tied at the hip for all those years. But ARCO was not the Anaconda Company. They felt no loyalty to Montana. They bought the Anaconda Company, and they didn't stick around for very long. They were just another big business, and they sold their interests in Montana and got out of here. And they're still paying for a lot of the Superfund sites, however. I remember one legislative hearing. The state had a trust fund or a special fund to hire lawyers to go after ARCO on some of this stuff. And a legislator named Red Manahan said, well, ARCO got one of the great sweetheart deals in American business. And the woman who represented ARCO was named Sandy Stash. And she said, I beg your pardon, sir. It was one of the worst deals in American business history. And she ran down all the costs they had at that point, and this was 10 or 15 years ago. So ARCO was quite a bit different than Anaconda. They had no loyalty to Montana, and they announced that shutdown right in the middle of an election, hoping to get a special session to relax Montana's air standards. The Republicans wanted to call one, Judge and Schwinn didn't, and so nothing changed. But you know, we lost all of those mining jobs, and then 3 or 4 years later, Denny Washington came along and reopened the mine, and it was a surface mine then, not an underground mine. And he said he would open it, but there could be no unions. And there haven't been unions there since. The workers instead get a nice bonus at the end of every year if the copper prices are high, and I think most of the workers are pretty happy with that.
All right, well, thank you very much, and Chuck will stay around, but let's thank him.